Today we're reading Genghis Khan and the Mongol Horde by Harold Lamb. Chapter 1, Under the North Wind. They rode, crouched forward in the saddle. The boy's father led the way as they searched for the lost horse. At times they glanced out at the haze along the skyline. All around them the plain swelled and sank, yellow with dead grass. The haze came from dust in the air, stirred up by the wind that pressed against their backs. Both the 9-year-old boy and his father knew that the stray horse would have kept moving downwind. The icy wind from the northern snow cut through the backs of their sheepskin jackets. The boy's name was Temujin, which meant iron. He was so accustomed to cold that he did not think about it. His sable fur cap with its leather flap protected his head and neck. His wide leather trousers were tucked into felt boots. The mane of his shaggy pony had been clipped so that the wire-like hair would not be blown up into his eyes. He had rubbed his face with grease to shield his frost sores from the wind. Something gray and swift flashed past Temujin, and his narrowed eyes turned to it instantly. It was only a dry thorn bush torn loose by the wind, but the 9-year-old boy was experienced enough to know that his father had enemies in grazing lands not far away. His father was a fighting man and head of a clan among the horse nomads. It was not a large clan, theirs of the Yaka Mongols, the great Mongols. The chieftain seemed to have a greater wealth of pride than of furs and good steel weapons. Temujin himself spent most of his time in the saddle, watching the herds while the grown men were off raiding or hunting. With his younger brothers, Temujin hunted the smaller game of the home pastures, the lean, winter-dwelling animals like the sables, marmots, or black foxes. They ate the flesh and saved the sinews and skins. Even their games were like strife. The nomad folk had horse races 10 miles out over the prairies and back. They had wrestling matches in which bones were broken. When they killed plenty of game, they ate all the meat they could to keep off hunger for the lean days to come. Temujin could go out 3 or 4 days without food. He often felt the ache of hunger before he found food again. Sometimes he took his knife, opened a vein in the horse he rode, and drank some of its blood. Then he closed the vein and went on. Now he noticed faint tracks in the dry, sandy earth. His father saw them too and turned aside to follow them. Temujin waited a minute and then said, "This herd is not ours. It grazed here before the wind came up." "I know that," his father replied. "Our horse joined it. The herd went to shelter when the wind came." Temujin was not so sure of that, but he could not object when his father had decided a thing. He had to obey the leader of the clan. On the barren plains, accidents or death happened too easily to nomad riders who did not act together. After a few minutes, they sighted the herd, crowded together with tails to the wind in a hollow behind standing rocks. Their missing gray horse with the white blaze was in the thick of the herd. Beyond the herd, tents took shape in the haze. Beside them stood wide, empty wagons. These round leather tents, shaped like domes, had been taken from the wagons and set up on the ground. Carefully, Temujin's father scanned the encampment and tethered riding horses. Then he reined forward and dismounted. These were strange folk, but no known enemies. When darkness came, the 2 Mongol riders were seated by a glowing fire of thornbush. They had been placed at the right-hand side, the side of honor of the master of the tents. Women brought in and set before them steaming cauldrons of millet boiled with sheep bones. "We have little to offer," said their host. "At the end of winter," replied Temujin's father, "this is much." Among the women, Temujin noticed a small girl with bright dark eyes. She moved about quickly without noise, smoothing out a red carpet that must have come from some caravan. She took a bone from the pot and carried it to the closed entrance flap, where she let it touch the wooden image hanging there. This was the household image of a spirit rider of the sky. Then the 10-year-old girl put the meat bone back in the pot and her dark eyes gleamed with pleasure. The owner of the tent noticed that the boy kept watching his young daughter. Eyeing the Mongol father and son, he told him she would make a good wife. Suddenly, Temujin asked if he could have her for a wife. He had a way of doing things swiftly like that, of becoming angry or fired with a new purpose. His father looked at the girl and asked her name. It was Borte, which meant that she had gray eyes. She is young, he objected, but Temujin was sure that he wanted her. When she is older, he pointed out, she will do well enough. When her name was spoken, Borte went to kneel quietly by the older women. It was easy to see that she had been well brought up. She is small, her father observed, but still, you might look at her. Secretly, he was pleased by the interest the visiting Mongols took in her. The chieftain of the Yaka Mongols had several thousand family tents following him over the grasslands, so Borte's father looked approvingly at the boy Temujin. Your son has a clear face and bright eyes, he said. The older men sat up until late that night to strike the bargain about the marriage. It was decided that after a few years, Temujin's father would pay the bride price of so many head of horses, oxen, and sheep. Although it was settled between them, it did not happen as they had expected. The next day the windstorm ceased, and Temujin's father led away their gray horse. The Mongol chieftain had to visit other settlements. He left Temujin with Borte's father to become better acquainted. At such a time, when snow swept the steppes and the wild fowl no longer came out of the sky to the frozen lakes, wandering minstrels were apt to ride in. There were old men, sometimes blind, who sang with droning voices the tales of a tribe's ancestors. Such legends Temujin stored away in his memory. Like most of the nomads, he could neither read nor write. He had to make up a map in his mind of the trails that led to higher ground and better grass in the heat of the summer, or to watering places in the sandy stretches of the Gobi. Now a minstrel with a fiddle came by. He sang the tale of an ancestral chieftain who had pulled the emperor of Cathay by the beard and had been poisoned as a result. Afterward, it seemed strange to Temujin that the minstrel had chosen that tale to tell. Temujin himself had never so much as seen the trading caravans of laden camels that passed along the Pelu, the great north road, going east to the gates in the wall. That wall had been built by the Chinese long before to keep the horse nomads from raiding their empire. They called the remote tent dwellers Tartars and greasy ones. In Cathay, Temujin's father had said, the people possessed so much wealth that they lived in houses of brick and stone. He said the tribes of the Gobi were safe from the power of Cathay only because they dwelt far away in lands too barren to be desired by the emperors behind the wall. Temujin thought of his words. We are not 100th part of Cathay. The only reason we have withstood her is that we are all nomads carrying our supplies about with us. We are experienced in our kind of warfare. When we can, we plunder what we need. When we cannot, we hide away. If we begin to build towns and change our habits, we would fall into misfortune. Because of the minstrel's song, the boy had his father's words in his mind. Then a rider came in with news that the Mongol chieftain had fallen sick in the tents of an enemy. Perhaps he had been poisoned. Although the boy rode to the place as fast as a horse could carry him, he found his father dead. No one would say how he died. There was nothing to do but bring his body back on a cart. In his own encampment, most of the warriors were talking together and deciding to leave. The deep water that strengthened us is gone, they said. The strong stone that protected us is broken. What have we to do with a woman and her children? Their loaded wagons began to trundle away from the camp. They were afraid to trust themselves and their families to a woman and an inexperienced boy like Temujin. The boy's anxious mother did what she could to keep the clan from breaking up. She took the pole with the 9 white yak tails, the standard of the Mongol clan, and went out to the deserters, pleading with them to stay. Only a few did so. As the eldest son, Temujin had to decide what his family should do. For a while he sat grieving by the embers within the hearthstones. Behind the hearth stretched the white horsehide that had been the seat of the Khan. Then Temujin told his mother that he would take the Khan's place. The family would stay with its herds and possessions in its home pastures by the two rivers. That meant they would all have to defend themselves against the dead chieftain's enemies, who would surely come to take vengeance on the children. End of chapter 1.